Greetings historians, welcome to Lore of the Dragon. So today I'm going to be going into the second act of A New Beginning, Reignited Legend. But I will be going over a summary just for those who don't know what the Reignited Legend is or its premise. So, in short, the Reignited Legend is a fan project allowing people to share their opinions on what would make a good remake or remaster for the Legend of Spyro series. So because of that and the fact this is a remake of the Legend of Spyro, nothing I'm saying here is actually canon. Just keep that in mind. Also, crediting is going to be slightly different in this part than it was in the first part. I'm going to be putting all the credits at the end of the video, mainly because I think that would give enough of an emphasis on the names and the people who actually participated in this, than just putting it in randomly in the video, or at least when the idea came up. The ideas are still being used, but I think that it would be best for the names to, well, be in a more credit-like end scene. Now, if I do miss anyone, you can just tell me in the comment section and I'll see about making a pinned comment about it. But anyway, let's get into the video. Spyro, his brother, and the Fire Guardian would approach a rocky pathway to the ancient temple, overgrown with vines and mushrooms. The surrounding ground would be littered with rubble, bones, and other tools of war, left there to rest over a decade ago. Here would be another area where the player could choose either to go straight ahead to the temple or investigate armor. And, if you chose to investigate this armor, or any other object that surrounded the entrance to the temple, Ignitus would vaguely answer things about the raid on the temple, perhaps what purpose these objects actually had, and things like that. However, when it came to answering stuff about the temple, again, he'd be rather vague on it, as he was still afraid to bring back memories of that night. However, if you did choose to investigate the remains, you wouldn't only be met with dialogue, but a distant and faint battle cry, something similar to what you heard during the night of the Dragon Temple raid. Now, when this happened, perhaps dialogue would play of Spyro being curious about the noise, but then there wouldn't be anything else really added on to that. However, later, this will come up. Now, as the three went further into the pathway, broken down defenses were blown to pieces and scattered across the ground. As they went further, small statues would be left cracked and broken, surrounded by rubble. Unlike in the original, the temple doors and the entrance to the temple would be left wide open from the raid, along with the surrounding entrance being left in ruins. But the larger statues and some murals still stood, allowing you as Spyro to be able to read what was inscribed in the statues, or rather have Ignitus explain what the pictures depicted, however vague or vivid his descriptions might be. There would also be a part of the temple, however, if you explored deep enough, where Ignitus would lose sight of Spyro, and this area would be shrouded in darkness. The path would be blocked off by fallen stone, vines, and mushrooms, each acting as a natural barrier to what lied beyond. But in the darkness, the breaking of stone and footsteps would be heard, coming from behind this pile. At the moment, there is nothing you could actually do to get through, and eventually Ignitus would call upon Spyro, wondering where he was. As you made your way to the temple, Spyro would ask what happened to this place, and Ignitus would respond, recounting the tidbits of memory he had of the temple raid. All the while, something in his voice would display a sense of sadness. But somewhere along the way, the Guardian would mention having to find the Pool of Visions, as it might help with their quest. Once you found the pool, Ignitus would explain what it could do story-wise, saying it could help in some cases to see far-off places, and he'd even mention that sometimes that he could glimpse into the future with it. However, it seemed that he was the only one of the Guardians that could do this, or even one of the few dragons who could use it. But it could be manipulated by Ignitus to help them see through it. For the time being, Ignitus, like in the original A New Beginning, they'd first try to find the Guardian of Electricity, Voltaire. Here you'd be introduced to something new with the Reignited Legend, which would be the world map, and an introduction to the soon-to-be unlocked quest system. For now, you would have no quests, but as the game goes on, you would gain more of these quests, and these quests would give various rewards, including armor, lore, and perhaps even something else that I'll talk about later in the Reignited Legend. Now, back to the map. The world would be shown through a gray and sepia tone hue, and its center would be the Dragon Temple. For the time being, Ignitus would act as a guide through the map, showing you the path to where the pool said Voltaire was, a frozen land called Dante's Freezer. From this point in the game, the temple would act as a hub, allowing you to select each chapter, or as mentioned before, quests you'd want to go on. Upon hearing where the Guardian was, Spyro would exclaim his eagerness to go, but Ignitus would stop him right away. He would mention that in order to deal with what lay ahead, he had to make sure that a simple flame wasn't the only thing Spyro could pull off with his elements. Then, the Guardian would walk past Spyro, and signal him to follow. As they walked through the room, they came across an archway, and on the other side, Spyro would see a massive statue, left there as the years went by. Spyro would look to the statue, and then to Ignitus, and ask who the statue was depicting, because it seemed rather familiar to him. The Guardian looked towards Spyro, only saying that the statue depicted what they knew as the Dark Master. Ignitus then pulled a lever, causing the floor beneath the statue to split around it, and the depiction itself would fall into the dark below. With the statue out of the way, the floor reconnected, leaving a large, empty room, the Dragon Dojo. And now, Spyro's training in the fire element would begin. This is where the game would introduce you to the main combat system, both for melee and basic elemental attacks. Ignitus would tell Spyro to pay attention to what was coming, much like in the Dragon Dojo in A New Beginning. Enemies would appear in the form of straw-filled dummies, brought to life through some sort of magic. As Spyro looked to these straw enemies, he'd make a snarky remark, saying that he wouldn't really have a problem with them. However, Ignitus would explain that these would be very similar to what he would face ahead, perhaps even mentioning that the dragons, known as the Beastmakers, would actually make these, perhaps just tying in some similarities between The Legend of Spyro, or at least this version, and the originals. I don't know, it might be a decent cameo. But he would also venture to mention that these wouldn't be as easy to face as he would think. Before Spyro would go on into the ring, Ignitus would walk in himself, and easily disperse of these enemies, using an attack that lit up the entire room in orange. And when the massive attack was finished, Ignitus would turn to Spyro and say that if he could master fire, he could very well do the same thing. Then, he would tell Spyro to face off against these straw enemies, at first just showing Ignitus what he could do. Now, these would be a series of melee attacks that he would learn from the swamp, and his basic elemental attack that you would be able to use at this point. But because of Spyro's performance, Ignitus would start to give Spyro advice on how to properly use fire. Spyro would banter back and forth, questioning, let's say, how Ignitus said to breathe, or just nitpick what he was saying in general. But eventually, Spyro's fire would start to burn brighter, the flame itself growing larger, and Spyro himself being able to use it in more varied ways. As you progress through the fight, you'd be reintroduced to elemental melee attacks. Just right now would be limited to fire as it was before. This being the case, the Guardian would tell Spyro to channel his elements into his talons. How this would control in the game would be through pressing a button separate from your normal elemental attack. Perhaps maybe even using the elemental button and then also using your melee attack to charge them up. I'm not entirely sure how a button layout would work, but I imagine a dual button system would work for this. Anyway, so in theory you could use both, but each ability would end sooner than normal, in some cases leaving the player rather in a dangerous position. So as well, your elemental melee attacks would be useful, however they wouldn't last as long as a normal elemental attack, and it would leave you in a rather dangerous position as you waited for a recharge of your elemental attacks. So again, it might leave you in a bit of a precarious situation, so you have to think about what kind of ability you want to use at that point. Quickly, Spyro would utilize the teachings of Ignitus, his talons lighting a flame. As Spyro hit the straw enemies, they would start to, of course, burn, leaving them in a continuous state of damage until the flames themselves dissipated. Now again, as the fight went on, there would even be more banter, perhaps something about alluding to the past, fleshing out the backstory of Ignitus, and perhaps a retrospect on Spyro's time in the temple before the raid. Maybe even in comparison, there could be talks about something that happened in the swamp. Now after this, the game would continue as it did in the original, leaving Spyro, Sparx, and Ignitus out on a balcony. But it wouldn't be through a cutscene. Rather, you'd be able to walk over with him, or you'd be able to walk back into the temple before you actually went with Ignitus. Now, if you went to the Pool of Visions, there would be something else unlocked there. The ability to go back to the Dragonfly Village if you wanted to. Now, of course, this would actually be the start of a somewhat fast travel system. You wouldn't have to go necessarily the same distance between the Dragonfly Village and the temple as you did before, but it's just something else you can do. Now, if you went back to Ignitus, you start to see that Spyro was eager to go and face off against whatever enemy he found, find the Guardian, Volteer, and bring him back to the temple. However, Ignitus would say that Spyro needs to calm down a bit, and to beware of what lied ahead. Now, this would lead into another section of actually training on how to fly. Now, of course, Spyro might not necessarily know how to fly at this point. Unlike in the original, Ignitus would teach him a little bit about flying just so he could get to Dante's Freezer. And after this, you'd be able to go all the way to Dante's Freezer and start your search for the Electricity Guardian. However, before you got to Dante's Freezer, you would be in this flying level, as you were in the original. But it wouldn't be on rails. You would actually be able to freely move about the level. An indicator on which way to go would be the waves or even the wind. During this flight level, you could actually land on the ships and fight the apes that were shooting at you. Maybe even lore, or even armor pieces. Later on, these levels would be optional. But when you are first traveling, you have to travel through them. Dante's Freezer itself, as Spyro landed, would appear open, but devoid of life. Ruins would be scattered around, left to be lost in the snow. Much like everything else, these ruins could be explored, and if you chose to travel into the ruins, you'd see depictions of ice dragons, perhaps even scrolls scattered around that Spyro could collect. Now, it wouldn't be apparent at the moment, but you would see references to Cyril and his heritage. Perhaps as well, you could see depictions of humanoid creatures, some that you would of course eventually encounter, in their undead forms. Perhaps there could even be collectibles dedicated to them as well, telling their story. Among these ruins would be a place not that much different than the Dragon Temple. However, it would be smaller in comparison. This would be the Ice Temple. It would also be the only way to get to the next part of the level, so you would have to go through it. Inside, however, unlike the rest of what you had seen, the temple would show signs of life. A fireplace would crackle in the distance, its orange light faintly illuminating the halls before you. As you moved closer, you would see most likely a fish hung over the fire, being cooked slowly by the flames. Spyro would then ask Sparks who he thought might be there, the dragonfly replying with only a few simple buzzes and a confused complexion. But suddenly, they'd hear a gasp, one coming from a distance. It would belong to a dragoness, pink in color, or rather, who we would call Ember. So, to explain why Ember's in Dante's Freezer, when the temple was raided, the Guardians took whichever hatchlings they could, scattering them around the realms, with each Guardian, after the raid, protecting them from the apes as long as they could. So, the various hatchlings that could be brought to safety were brought to these last few territories held by the dragons, including Dante's Freezer, where Ember and others, perhaps even including a close friend of hers named Flame, would be under the protection of Cyril. However, that would change after a creature of monstrous power arrived and had taken Cyril captive, placing a weakened and broken Volteer there instead, tying him down in chains. Other ice dragons would have been there to defend the land, but each of them would fall. Ember describing this monster that took them down as no more less than a demon. Some were able to escape, Ember and Flame notably, but the two were separated. Ember being left unsure of what happened to the Guardians or the others. The Dragoness can only say for months now that she had been left to fend for herself after she escaped. Spyro would tell the Dragoness that he was there to free Volteer, in the hopes of taking down the Dark Master and his army. In return, Ember would go on to explain a bit about what was going on as of the present day. Ape forces now patrolled where the dragons once did, and as far as Ember knew, there was no way to get past them, and to Volteer, unless maybe a certain purple dragon was around. So, Ember in this is sort of similar to her A Hero's Tale and Shadow Legacy counterpart. However, at first there isn't any direct sign that she likes Spyro, outside of implying it through tone. However, it would only be because Spyro is the hero saving the damsel in distress, as it were. Now, as they set off to face against the apes and find Volteer, Ember said that she might be able to help here and there, giving Spyro hints throughout the level of where to go, mainly in the form of different mile markers, like a tower or something of that sort. But that wouldn't stop you from being able to inspect different lost bits of armor, more ruins, and that sort of thing. Ember would take an alternate path from Spyro and Sparks as well, so for the most part, you could still venture through the different parts of the level, at least the parts not blocked by icy walls. I'll get back to that at some point. As you progress through the level, it'd most likely be normal, of course, with the addition of hidden passages, collectibles, and perhaps even more pieces of armor that you could collect and then use for customization. But soon you'd run into the apes, and once again, they'd be varied in their abilities and look. They'd of course be adorning thicker coverings than their counterparts in the swamp, with some basic infantry here and there, but as well fighting among these different types of apes, you'd find a new, more deadly foe in Dante's Freezer. These would be staff-wielding apes. Let's just call them warlocks. They'd be harnessing crystals of some kind, shooting electricity from them. When killed, unlike their normal counterparts, they'd actually drop these crystals, and when approached, they'd float around Spyro, dissipating into particles, the energy being absorbed by his body. While Spyro would comment feeling strange, he wouldn't exactly think much of it. However, as you went through Dante's Freezer, this would actually be how you get Spyro's second element, electricity. But soon after, you'd actually see electricity shooting out of Spyro, and soon enough he realized that again, a new ability presented itself. The dragon would of course, like in the original, be able to shock enemies, and drag them around with his electricity, as that's actually pretty fun. But something new would be a boost in speed, a dash of sorts. This could be used just for running faster, perhaps shocking enemies if you came into contact with them. And even more abilities would come in the future. Of course, Spyro would be able to switch between fire and electricity, giving some more accessibility when it comes to platforming. Now, as they travel further into Dante's Freezer, Spyro and Ember would meet again, meeting in a place where she thought Voltaire was being held, an ice cavern. So, Spyro made his way in, and like A New Beginning before, he'd be attacked by the Ice King. Now, the attacks of the King would be varied, using both his environment and perhaps some more unique attacks than what he had in the original game. And perhaps a bit of a different design to make him stand out a bit more than, let's say, the rest of these undead enemies. Once his king was defeated, Spyro would look around for the Guardian, and eventually find him sitting on a patch of ice, chained down. He'd walk up to Voltaire, and this interaction would go more or less like it did in the original, minus talking Sparks, and instead of thinking that the purple dragon was hearsay, Voltaire would be asking Spyro a multitude of questions, asking which elements he had and how easy it was to blast through the apes. But before they could do anything more, Ember would come up behind Spyro. Now, shortly thereafter they would go back to the temple, and actually bring Ember with them. And now they had to look for the second Guardian, which would be Cyril, according to Ignitus. Now, again, it would be much like the original, with Cyril being held in tall plains. And of course, before you went, you would also be taught by Voltaire how to use the electricity ability. Now, perhaps there would be a different area you would do this in than, let's say, the Dragon Dojo, but in short, you would just be learning how to use the electricity ability a bit more. Now, perhaps while you were waiting for Ignitus to find the next Guardian, Ember would ask Spyro about this rubble covering this hallway, the same one Spyro encountered earlier when he first came to the temple. And she would ask what Spyro thought it was, or what was behind it. Spyro would probably comment that he didn't quite know, but he heard things from behind. Maybe there would be banter back and forth about them maybe telling the Guardians about this. But Ignitus would call them to the pool. Now, in short, this would sort of go along like it did in A New Beginning. Except now you'd be able to travel back to Dante's Freezer if you wanted to. However, at this point, it might be best just to go to Tall Plains, as you might be able to get a couple abilities there that might help you if you ever wanted to go back to Dante's Freezer. As the story normally would continue, you would go to Tall Plains to help save Cyril. Spyro and Sparks' flight over to Tall Plains would be similar to that of Dante's Freezer and the original Tall Plains level, with floating islands appearing as you were getting closer to this next area, along with ships similar to the flying ships in the original A New Beginning. Now, these ships would be somewhat similar to the ones you encounter on your way to Dante's Freezer, with various pieces of loot, lore, and perhaps even quests inside them. The difference would be enemies, primarily. Perhaps even this would be where you find your first major enemies. Of course, at some point, the two would arrive in tall plains and begin searching for the Ice Guardian. You would see generally the same structures you once did in the original New Beginning. However, in the distance, you would see destroyed huts, perhaps even destroyed villages. Carvings etched in stone would still be scattered around the area, and these walls would act to make tall plains open, but somewhat linear at times. Now, unlike Dante's Freezer, there would be no dragon structure here. Instead, there would be carvings in this stone, telling the stories of the tenuous relationship between the dragons and the Atslawa, natives to tall plains. But there would also be other carvings alongside these, depictions of what seemed to be golems from Dawn of the Dragon, and the natives praising them. For the most part, Tall Plains would play out similarly to how it did in A New Beginning, with of course some added content. You'd fight through apes of varying types, perhaps some that could even be found off the beaten path. But at some point, you'd be able to travel to one of these villages seen in the distance, now up close and littered with torn cloth and burnt wood. Like in the Dragon Temple, echoes could be heard, these ones resembling fighting, swords clashing, and fire raging. Overhead in the distance as well would be a dark dragon soaring to the clouds above. It would disappear quickly behind another floating island, but just as suddenly, the only thing that was visible being smoke and tattered cloth. Suddenly, a male Atlawa would come out from behind a tent. He pointed a spear at Spyro, mentioning that the dragons had done more than enough to ruin his home. But through some level of negotiation, Spyro would tell Cain, this native's name, that he was there to help. And Cain said, if so, that he would also help Spyro, but this would be from a distance, much like Ember in Dante's Freezer. Spyro would be led through the level much like before, until they found where Cyril had been held and locked away. It would be similar to that of the original A New Beginning, with Spyro encountering a god of the Atslawa, which had been used by the apes to guard the Ice Guardian. The area surrounding the boss arena would be similar to that of a magic fence, one of which Spyro could enter but couldn't leave once the fighting had begun. Speaking of the boss, the design, at least in some regards, would be a golem, like the stories in the stone depicted earlier. Of course, smaller, formed of rock and earth instead of fire. The fight would most likely be not only fighting the boss off itself, but nature as it tried to grab Spyro, immobilizing the dragon as the golem tried to end him. However, eventually, Spyro would emerge victorious, and Cyril would be approached by the young dragon and dragonfly. Before they left Tall Plains, Cain would say half-hearted thanks to the purple dragon, then say he was going to find the rest of his people, disappearing to the distance as the dragons took flight. On the way to the temple, Cyril would more or less train Spyro in the ways of using the ice element, as right away, when they traveled over, he thought that the cold air might allow Spyro to channel the ice element more effectively, and so they started training in the air. Now after this, once you actually went to the temple and were able to use the Pool of Visions, you'd actually be able to go back to Dante's Freezer with the Ice Breath and break these ice barriers from before, as these different barriers are some sort of magic and can only be unlocked using the very element they're made out of. So you couldn't necessarily just melt it with fire, as it's not particularly normal ice. And of course after that you'd be able to find more areas of these different levels like Dante's Freezer. And these alternate paths would actually be all throughout the game, not just in Dante's Freezer. Now back to the temple. Cyril and Spyro would land on one of these temple platforms, heading inside to meet Ignitus and Voltaire. As of the moment you arrived, Ignitus would have found the whereabouts of the Earth Guardian, Terrador. You'd be given a few options as to what you could do. The main one being to talk to Ignitus and go to Munitions Forge, or to even go to these other levels you've already been to. Perhaps if you decided to explore the temple, you'd find Ember in the courtyard from the beginning of the game, where she'd be reminiscing about some memories of hers. And if you decide to talk to her, perhaps she would allude to some past friendship that she and Spyro had. But as well, Spyro would mention something about a light blue dragoness, one that he remembered being a close friend of, but one that he couldn't quite put a face to. Ember might remember tidbits as well, but nothing that would really help Spyro in determining who this dragoness was. Now, if you decide to talk to Ignitus immediately or talk to him later, perhaps he would mention some things about his involvement in the defense of Munitions Forge during his time in the war. and that he, because of that, would come along with Spyro himself, as he already knew the lay of the land. And so they would take flight to Munitions Forge, going to save the Earth Guardian. Ignitus would tell Spyro that he'd keep to the skies above, distracting what he could away from Spyro and Sparks. But he'd still be able to tell Spyro where to go from time to time once he found an opening. The purple dragon would travel through the caverns of the mountain and try to sneak around. The travel through Munitions Forge would be much the same as it was in the original A New Beginning, with some added details, perhaps an area used to melt and craft armor even. Of course, through the caverns you'd meet and free the Man-Were-Smalls from the apes. And you could of course talk to them, perhaps learn more about Munitions Forge and its history, or just even more about the Man-Were-Smalls. It could even be the case that there was some level of equipment left over from the battles between the apes and the dragons. This battle being the one that Ignitus mentioned earlier, the one that he actually took part in. Of course, eventually you'd find yourself diving deeper into the level, and without Ignitus to guide you, you'd be shown the way by these strange blue shadows, and possibly also some sort of indicator like lamps, that you would eventually find yourself fighting with the same mini-boss before you found the Earth Guardian. But in the end, you just end up where Terrador was being held captive. When you reached where Terrador was, you'd see he was in the same situation he was in A New Beginning, attached to a power crystal, which would rather confuse Spyro as he hadn't seen this beforehand. After your fight with the mini-boss, Spyro would free Terrador, the Guardian being in shock that the purple dragon, being so young, freed him from his captivity. Spyro would then point out that it wasn't just he who had come to save him, but Ignitus as well, which Sparks might have a retort to since he also came along, but we just only hear that in the form of buzzing. Everything would seem to go rather fine, but a screech suddenly came from behind the dragons. Terrador would stop in his tracks, while Spyro would look around to see where the noise had come from. Around them shadows would form, and eventually they would take the form of a slender, ghastly-looking dragon. Symbols would be plastered on its head and shoulders, and just as Spyro was taking this all in, it would begin to raise its talons higher into the air, ready to strike down at the purple dragon. Ignitus would come from above, striking the shadow dragon with fire, then turn to Terrador, Sparks, and Spyro, ordering them to run while they could. Terrador would insist he could stay and fight, but the Fire Guardian pressured him further, telling him he needed to train Spyro in the Earth element. And before any more could be said, Ignitus took to the skies with the Shadow Dragon. Spyro would argue a bit with Terrador to try and stay, but Terrador now realizing the danger they were in, and what he had to do. But Terrador repeated what Ignitus had said, and also added that the only way to help Ignitus now was to finally complete his training and to learn how to use the Earth element. And so, only a few moments later, they would heed the orders of Ignitus and start to head back to the temple. Back and forth, Ignitus and the Shadow Dragon would fight. Meanwhile, Spyro and Sparks would get separated from Terrador, and this ghastly dragon would chase after them, forcing Spyro and Sparks to soar through magma-filled caverns, just to try and get away. But eventually, they'd go back out into the open, and this is where they would almost be caught, but Ignitus once again would intervene. Ignitus would again order them to go, and with no further delay, Spyro, Sparks, and Terrador finally flew back to the temple, leaving the fate of Ignitus left unknown. Now that's going to be it for Act 2. Took me long enough to get this out. Oh boy. Now hopefully Act 3 will be out sooner than later, and if you want to stay updated on that, you can go follow me on my Twitter account, or you can stay updated on my community page. Or rather, if you want to talk to people who are in the Lord of the Dragon community, you can go join my Discord. The link to the Twitter and the Discord will be down in the description below. Now, on screen will be everyone who participated in this part, and I'm going to be doing something similar for Act 3, and then going forward into the next different parts of this series. Now, of course, if you just want to stick around Lord of the Dragon and see these things as they come out, I'm more than fine with that. But anyway, that's going to be it. I hope to see you all in the next lore or speculation video. Stay safe, historians.